For thousands of years, the Nile River has been the very definition of life in North Africa. It carved its way through deserts, nurtured ancient civilizations, and continues to sustain millions of people even today. From the fertile lands of Egypt to the highlands of Ethiopia, the Nile has been both a giver of life and a source of power. But in the 21st century, this ancient river is at the center of a modern crisis, one that could spiral into a major international conflict. As the climate warms, populations grow, and water becomes the new global currency, experts warn that the next great war might not be fought over oil or land, but over water. And the Nile, the world's longest river, could be where it all begins. The Nile stretches over 6,600 kilometers, flowing through 11 countries in Africa: Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, South Sudan, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt. But for most of the river's history, two countries have been the most dependent on its waters: Ethiopia and Egypt. To understand why this river could start a war, we need to understand how the Nile sustains them both and how it connects their destinies. Egypt, often called the gift of the Nile, owes its entire existence to this river. More than 95% of Egypt's population lives within a few kilometers of the Nile's banks. The rest of the country is barren desert. Without the Nile, there would be no agriculture, no drinking water, and no way to support its 110 million citizens. For Egypt, the Nile isn't just water, it's survival. Every drop that flows from upstream is a matter of life and death. On the other hand, Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile begins, contributes almost 85% of the total water that eventually flows into Egypt. The Ethiopian highlands are the true source of the Nile's power, and that's where our story takes a dramatic turn. In 2011, Ethiopia made a bold announcement that would reshape the politics of the entire region. The country unveiled plans to build the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, often shortened to GERD, on the Blue Nile.
Now, after 14 years of construction, Ethiopia has officially inaugurated a controversial mega dam built over the River Nile.
Once completed, it would be the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa, producing more than 5,000 megawatts of electricity. For Ethiopia, a nation that had long struggled with poverty and limited infrastructure, the GERD represented hope. It promised power for homes, factories, and industries, a path to economic independence and regional influence. Ethiopians saw it as a symbol of pride and progress, even naming it the Renaissance Dam to mark a new era of self-reliance. But while Ethiopians celebrated, Egypt began to panic. To Egyptian officials, the dam looked less like a symbol of progress and more like a threat, a potential chokehold on their single most important resource. Egypt feared that if Ethiopia controlled the flow of the Nile, it could decide how much water reached downstream each year. And for a country that depends almost entirely on the Nile for fresh water, any reduction in flow could spell disaster. Even if Ethiopia had no intention of cutting off water, the process of filling the dam's massive reservoir could temporarily reduce the river's flow for years, affecting Egypt's agriculture, economy, and food security. The core of Egypt's fear lies in geography. While the Nile technically begins as two rivers, the White Nile from Lake Victoria and the Blue Nile from Ethiopia, it is the Blue Nile that carries nearly all the fertile silt and most of the water. The two merge in Sudan, forming the main Nile that flows north into Egypt. This means that what Ethiopia does upstream has a direct and powerful impact on what happens downstream. If Ethiopia releases less water, Egypt immediately feels it. And that creates a dangerous imbalance, one that has already led to years of political tension and diplomatic standoffs. To fully understand the roots of this conflict, we have to go back in time to the early 20th century, when much of Africa was still under colonial rule. In 1929, the British, who controlled Egypt and parts of East Africa, signed a treaty called the Nile Waters Agreement. This agreement gave Egypt and Sudan nearly complete control over the river's water. Upstream countries like Ethiopia were not consulted at all. Then, in 1959, another treaty between Egypt and Sudan reaffirmed this control, dividing almost all of the Nile's annual flow between just those two nations. Ethiopia, the very country where most of the Nile's water originates, was left out once again. For decades, this arrangement worked in Egypt's favor. But as Ethiopia began to modernize, it started questioning these old colonial-era agreements, calling them unfair and outdated. When Ethiopia began building the GERD in 2011, it did so without Egypt's approval, arguing that the old treaties were illegitimate and that every nation had the right to use its own natural resources. Egypt, however, insisted that those agreements were binding and that Ethiopia had no right to alter the river's flow unilaterally. What followed was a decade of intense diplomacy and growing distrust. Negotiations were held in Addis Ababa, Cairo, and Khartoum. At one point, even the United States tried to mediate a deal, but each round of talks ended the same way, with no agreement. The biggest sticking point has always been how quickly Ethiopia fills the dam's reservoir. The faster Ethiopia fills it, the less water flows downstream to Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia wants to fill the dam quickly to start generating electricity and recover its investment. Egypt, however, demands that the filling process be slow and carefully managed to avoid major disruptions. Each side has its own logic, but both are driven by survival. Tensions escalated further in 2020 when Ethiopia began the first phase of filling the reservoir, without a final agreement. Egypt saw this as a violation of trust. Its leaders warned that all options were on the table, including military action. The phrase sent shockwaves through the region. After all, Egypt has one of the most powerful militaries in Africa, and a direct strike on the dam could cripple Ethiopia's project, but also risk plunging the entire continent into chaos. Now, it's important to understand that war over water might sound extreme, but it's not as far-fetched as it seems. History is filled with conflicts that began over access to essential resources, and as climate change worsens, water is becoming one of the scarcest resources of all. Across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, countries are facing severe water shortages. Rivers that once flowed abundantly are drying up, and rainfall is becoming unpredictable. The Nile's flow, which has remained steady for centuries, is now under pressure from both population growth and climate change. Egypt's population is increasing rapidly, while Ethiopia is eager to harness the river for development. Both sides need the Nile more than ever, and there simply may not be enough to satisfy everyone. Sudan, which lies between Egypt and Ethiopia, finds itself in a difficult middle position. On one hand, Sudan could benefit from the GERD. The dam could regulate flooding and provide cheap electricity. On the other hand, it worries that rapid filling or mismanagement could reduce water supplies and harm its agriculture. Sudan's position has shifted several times, sometimes siding with Ethiopia, sometimes with Egypt. This uncertainty adds yet another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. If diplomatic efforts fail, what could a conflict look like? Some analysts have speculated that Egypt might carry out airstrikes to damage or disable the dam. It has the military capability and the motivation. However, such an attack would be extremely risky. The GERD is located deep within Ethiopian territory, surrounded by rugged mountains and defended by advanced anti-aircraft systems. Any strike would require crossing Sudanese airspace, potentially dragging Khartoum into the conflict as well. Ethiopia, meanwhile, could retaliate by mobilizing its own forces or targeting Egyptian interests in the region. A war between these two nations could destabilize all of Northeast Africa, affecting neighboring countries like Eritrea, South Sudan, and Somalia. It could also draw in major global powers, since both the United States and China have strategic interests in the region. But war is not the only outcome. Many experts believe that cooperation is still possible and essential. Water doesn't have to divide, it can unite. If Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt could agree on a fair management plan, the Nile could support all three countries. Ethiopia could generate electricity and share power with its neighbors. Sudan could benefit from improved flood control, and Egypt could continue to receive enough water to sustain its people. For that to happen, however, trust must be rebuilt, and that may be the hardest task of all. Part of the challenge lies in perception. For Ethiopia, the GERD represents progress and sovereignty, the right to use its own natural resources without external control. For Egypt, it represents vulnerability, the fear that another country could literally turn off its water supply. Both narratives are deeply emotional and tied to national pride. That makes compromise difficult, even when logic demands it. At a global level, the Nile dispute is part of a much larger trend. As climate change accelerates, water wars are becoming increasingly likely. From the Indus River shared by India and Pakistan to the Tigris and Euphrates between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, many of the world's great rivers flow across borders, and each is becoming a potential flashpoint. The United Nations has warned that by 2050, more than half of the world's population could face water stress. In regions where political tensions are already high, the struggle for water could push nations toward confrontation. But even in the face of such challenges, there is hope. Several international organizations and regional alliances have been working to mediate the Nile dispute. The African Union, in particular, has called for African solutions to African problems, encouraging dialogue instead of division. Some technical proposals have suggested shared data systems, joint dam management committees, and even compensation mechanisms if one country's actions harm another's. These ideas are promising, but they require political will. The story of the Nile isn't just about water, it's about power, survival, and the choices nations make when resources grow scarce. The same river that sustained ancient civilizations like Egypt and Nubia now tests the ability of modern nations to coexist. The stakes couldn't be higher. For Egypt, the Nile is existence itself. For Ethiopia, it's the key to escaping poverty and building a future. Both are right in their own way, and both risk losing everything if they can't find common ground. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Nile is that no one truly owns it. The river existed long before any modern border, and it will flow long after. The challenge for humanity is to learn how to share it. As the old saying goes, you can't fight water, it always finds a way. If the people who depend on the Nile can find a way to cooperate, the river could become a symbol of unity once again, just as it was thousands of years ago. But if mistrust and fear continue to grow, the Nile might instead become a symbol of division, and possibly the trigger for the next great global conflict. In the end, the Nile River carries more than just water. It carries history, identity, and the fate of millions. It has seen empires rise and fall, and it has witnessed humanity's greatest achievements and worst mistakes. Today, as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam looms over its waters, the Nile faces a new test, one that will determine whether nations can rise above old grudges and embrace cooperation, or whether they'll repeat the same mistakes that history has warned us about time and again. The world is watching, because the outcome here could set the tone for how humanity handles water disputes everywhere. So, when experts say that the Nile River could start the next world war, they're not just being dramatic. They're reminding us that in a world growing hotter, drier, and more crowded, water is the one resource we can't live without. The story of the Nile is the story of the future, of how we share the planet, its rivers, and its life-giving resources. Whether it becomes a river of peace or a river of conflict depends entirely on what we choose to do next. If you are interested in watching videos like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and give your opinion in the comment section. We'll see you in the next video.